January 1966 was an earth-shaking month in comic book history when co-creator Steve Ditko left the rising success of The Amazing Spider-Man and the reins were given over to John Romita, who began a lifelong connection to the character, with his Spider-Man art becoming the literal brand of Marvel Comics for over a decade and stretching years and years later. But how did it happen? What did Romita think of Spider-Man before he took over the comic? Here's a hint. He didn't really like it that much. But of course the answers are always more complex, so stay tuned and you'll hear it from Jazzy John Romita himself, because that's coming up next on Hero Journalism. Hello heroes, 4Kate here with a little bit of Spider-Man comic book history. In 1965, John Romita Sr. was thrilled to finally have regular work, having taken over the Daredevil title, finally giving some stability to both his income and the Daredevil comic book, which had been suffering from 12 issues of revolving artists. Meanwhile, over at Amazing Spider-Man, Steve Ditko had become the primary creative force on a run of comic book storytelling that we now look back at as one of the greatest in the medium. But what did Romita think of that run? What did he think about his contemporary? Well, I got to talk to him back in 2001 at San Diego Comic-Con, and here's what he told me.
The first time I heard about Spider-Man, strangely enough, was when Stan asked me what did I think of it. After I had been with him, I went back to Stan in '65 after an 8-year stint at DC, and I was embarrassed to tell him I had never seen the book. It had been in existence almost 3 years. And I was mortified. I said, I'm sorry, I haven't seen it. I barely had time to read, my own stuff. And when he told me it was the second best selling book that Marvel had, I was surprised, not because it wasn't good, I just didn't think it had the elements that were appealing to people. It looked so strange to me. I saw, Peter Parker with glasses and a lot of little panels and a non-superheroic body on the hero, and I wasn't aware that, the old story where I didn't realize it was elegant at the time. I didn't find out till later that it was eloquent.
Of course, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's relationship was famously troubled, mainly due to issues of pay and credit on Steve Ditko's behalf. Stan knew that the relationship was deteriorating, and he decided to hatch a little insurance plan. He also had Romita penciling Daredevil at the time, so he wrote a 2-issue arc guest-starring Spider-Man into Daredevil to see how Romita would handle the character.
When I got into it, when Stan gave me a stack of Spider-Man books, 30-odd books, to get familiar with the character before I did a 2-book tryout with Daredevil, I started going through the stuff, and first it was rather, very quickly done. You could see Ditko was knocking it out at first. He was just doing the simplest technique as quickly as possible, which we were all hoping to do to try and make money in those days. And then I noticed this gradual growth and development of the story, and in the 20th issue, and then the 30th issue, and then suddenly he built to this crescendo in the 33rd issue. And I said, wow, this stuff is real. No wonder people are buying this book. So I had to admit that, my first impression was misleading. It was rather crude looking, because I was looking at number 1 in Amazing Fantasy 15. But by the time I got through the series, I realized what had been developing. That it was not only... See, I always look at a book visually. I didn't read any of it. I was just looking at the pictures and watching Ditko's development and polish. So I never had a chance to really digest how intelligent it was and how it was growing. When I started to get into the 2 scripts that Stan gave me on Daredevil, I gained a lot of insight into it.
Stan Lee put uncommonly special emphasis on the Spider-Man Daredevil crossover in the house ads for Marvel's lineup that month. It's weird. When I picked up Marvel Masterworks reprints of the early Daredevil issues, I was surprised by how little Spider-Man looked like the Romita Spider-Man. But of course, it wasn't the Romita Spider-Man. He was doing the Ditko Spider-Man. It was still Steve Ditko's character. But soon after the second issue of the Spider-Man Daredevil crossover hit the newsstands, Steve Ditko walked into the Marvel offices, turned in his latest assignment, and a resignation letter. Despite Stan Lee's displeasure with Steve Ditko over issues of pay and credit and creative control, he knew deep down, even if he couldn't quite admit that Ditko was a central part of the comic book, he knew deep down how good Steve Ditko was and how much Steve Ditko's art was a driver for comic book sales. So deep down, he was a little nervous. And you can sense a little bit of that in a recording from a comic convention in New York around that time, right before Romita debuted as the new Spider-Man artist.
Now, we've just lost the artist who does Doc Strange, Steve Ditko, who also does Spider-Man. And I feel as badly about it as you do. He's a very peculiar guy. He's a great talent, and but he's a little eccentric. Anyway, I haven't spoken to this guy for over a year. He mails in the work, and I write the stories, and that's the way he liked to work. And one day he just phoned and he said, "I'm in." So that was it. So this is the acid test now, because he was such a popular artist. I think that we've managed to find people to replace him where those boos will change to a chorus of cheers. But I know how it is, because you get sentimental about an artist, especially one as good as he, and I feel the same way.
Despite being aware of his deteriorating relationship with Steve Ditko, Stan Lee was still blindsided by the move. Allegedly, he was so furious, he refused to actually meet with Ditko to accept the resignation letter, something that rankled Ditko for decades to come. Stan Lee would often say in future years, "I don't know why Ditko quit." And Ditko, when asked, would often refer back to that day. He would say Stan would know if he listened, but he didn't give Ditko the respect of even meeting with them during that resignation. But for John Romita, it turned out to be a life-changing moment, one that launched him to iconic status in comic books.
We were already ascending a little bit anyway. I was lucky enough to be there when the book caught fire, and so whatever credit I get for that, I'm grateful for.
And yet he didn't recognize the dramatic power of that Ditko run, at least not until he was on the book and felt he had to dig back into those back issues for research purposes. Now he looks back and he sees that run as an important turning point for complex storytelling in the comic medium.
And since that time, I realized increasingly every time when I got on the book that the appeal was tremendous, because it was talking to every young kid and every kid going through high school and starting to go to college and having girl trouble, dead on. And as opposed to the comic books of my youth and the intervening years, the comic books were one-dimensional. They were just cardboard cutouts. They were not perfect human beings. They were just bland human beings. They never got excited. They never screamed. They never dropped anything. So he was making people drop the china, trip over steps, and acting human.
That was jazzy John Romita reflecting on the moment Spider-Man came into his life.